Today we're going to look at fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. We'll break this up into a couple of parts today. So most of your body weight is going to come from water. It's 99% of the fluid volume out of the cells. All cells use water as a diffusion medium and to distribute gases, nutrients, and waste. As you age, the percent of water in the human body does decrease. So it starts out very high as a fetus and moves down to about 50% as an elderly person. So water balance will influence a lot of things. So in the case of having excessive blood loss, sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, you can have decreased sodium concentration of the interstitial fluid and plasma, or hyponatremia. That will decrease the osmolarity of the interstitial fluid and plasma, leading to osmosis of water from the interstitial fluid into the intracellular fluid. And water intoxication can occur with that. So we have intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. Extracellular fluid is about a third of the volume. This will include interstitial fluid, plasma, and body fluids. So most of the interstitial fluid is in the peripheral tissues and the plasma of the circulating blood. There's also some in lymph, cerebral spinal fluid, synovial fluid, and the serous aqueous humor. With this picture here, you can see intracellular fluid is inside the cell, extracellular fluid is outside the cell. So when blood pressure is low, we have lots of mechanisms to be able to try and change this. One is by changing the blood volume. So when the kidney perceives that there is low blood pressure, you're going to have renin be secreted, and that will lead to the RAH system's pathway, where you'll have angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2 to increase water being reabsorbed. If the blood pressure is too high in the right atrium of the heart, atrial natriuretic peptide is going to cause the kidneys to excrete more sodium, and the water will follow. Intracellular fluid is about 2/3 of the fluid volume. It's inside the cells. There's only two places for the exchange between the compartments. The cell plasma membranes will separate the intracellular from interstitial fluid. So you can have fluid cross the plasma membranes, and this can happen through osmosis, which would be only the water moving to the area of higher concentration. You could have diffusion of the solvent and the solute moving to equalize the concentrations. Facilitated diffusion through carrier-mediated transport is another way. The capillaries have thin enough walls for exchange to occur between the plasma and interstitial fluid. So fluid balance is trying to stabilize the fluids, the solute concentrations, and the pH of both the extracellular and intracellular fluid to maintain homeostasis. When you look, this is just giving a visual here of solid versus fluid components of the body. So males do have slightly higher fluids than females. When you look at the fluids, 2/3 is intracellular, 1/3 is extracellular. Of the extracellular, 80% is interstitial fluid, 20% is plasma. So to obtain fluid balance, it's important that the water gains equal the water losses to maintain that. The digestive system is the main way you're going to get water in. The urinary system is the main way of getting it out. Electrolyte balance is important to balance the rates of absorption and loss. Electrolytes are going to be the ions. They can produce electric current in a solution. So they are important for cells, for sodium potassium pumps, among many other things. Your acid-base balance, when the production of hydrogen ions is offset by their loss, you can change the pH. So we need to be able to balance out the pH because the body generates acids in normal metabolic operations. The kidneys secrete hydrogen ions and generate a buffer system. Lungs excrete carbon dioxide. So water is the largest single component of the body. that is going to be highest in an infant because they've got relatively low body fat and bone mass. As you get older, it's going to decline. So we continually exchange the water and the solutes among the compartments through filtration, reabsorption, and diffusion, and osmosis. So the body gains water by ingesting liquids and moist foods. Typically, that's about 2,300 milliliters a day. There can be some variation in there as well. So if a person is exercising and removing more water through sweat or other things, they're probably going to drink more. They're usually going to be thirsty to offset that. You have metabolic synthesis of water. So if you look at cellular respiration and dehydration synthesis of things, you'll notice little arrows where water leaves the cycle. That is your metabolic water. And then body losses of water through the kidneys. That's about 1,500 milliliters. You have about 600 milliliters evaporate from the skin, 300 milliliters from the lungs, 100 milliliters from feces. So if a person is exercising, the evaporation from the skin could change. If they're in warm or humid conditions, that can change as well. So regulating body water gain, a lot of it is going to be tied to how much cellular respiration is going on, because that's going to be tied to what kind of activity you're doing. So water intake is the main way to regulate water balance. That's the easiest way of getting it in. And you can do this through thirst. This just gives a visual comparison of ways of getting water in and then of ways of getting water out. Dehydration occurs when the water loss is greater than the gain. When you have that, you'll have a decrease in blood volume, decreased blood pressure. That will lead to the RAA system getting turned on to increase the blood osmolarity and stimulate the thirst center and the hypothalamus. You'll have decreased flow of saliva, so having a dry mouth and pharynx, that helps to make you thirsty. So when you're dehydrated, you have decreased saliva, increased blood osmolarity, decreased blood volume. All of these things will lead to stimulating the thirst center and the hypothalamus to try and get you to take in more water and offset that dehydration. So some of the amounts of water and solutes lost via sweating and exhaling are important to consider as well, especially if under warm conditions. But the main way your body is going to do this is to adjust how much is lost in urine. If you've already lost a lot in urine and you're dehydrated, it can get to a point where you won't effectively sweat to cool yourself, and it becomes more difficult to maintain proper body temperature. So some hormones in here, ADH or antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, is the main hormone that regulates water loss from the hypothalamus. So it's produced in the hypothalamus, released through the posterior pituitary. It's going to alter the permeability of the principal cells in the collecting duct so that you'll reabsorb more water, and the urine will become more concentrated to decrease the urine volume. So if you increase hydration, you decrease ADH and increase urine volume. If you decrease hydration, there's increased ADH, decrease in urine volume. So what ADH does, it keeps the sodium, excretes the potassium so that you'll reabsorb more water. So things that would cause that to happen: dehydration, low blood pressure, low blood volume, vomiting, diarrhea, and sweating. Angiotensin II, this is part of that RAA system. It's going to correct the renal blood flow. It's going to dilate the afferent arterioles and constrict the efferent arterioles. This will make the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorb sodium and water, and then you'll have the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex that will increase the rate of sodium reabsorption. So then you reabsorb more water. Where sodium goes, water follows. Atrial natriuretic peptide is going to promote the excretion of sodium and chloride with water corresponding along with it to decrease the blood volume. So when you're dehydrated, This will be detected by the hypothalamus. ADH is secreted, and it's going to tell you to increase the blood volume by keeping more water from the kidneys. It will also make you thirsty to take in more water to get to homeostasis. If a person is overhydrated, the hypothalamus will detect this and inhibit ADH, so you're less thirsty, and the kidneys will excrete more water. So factors that reduce the loss of water: the hypothalamus, it will make you thirsty. Angiotensin II leads to aldosterone, releasing the loss of water in the urine. You're going to absorb more sodium and chloride. Antidiuretic hormone is also going to increase the permeability, so more water is reabsorbed and lost in the urine. Things that are going to increase water loss in the urine: atrial natriuretic peptide. It's going to excrete the sodium and chloride. Water is going to follow the salt, so you'll excrete the excess water. And then you can have fluid imbalance between the intracellular and interstitial fluids can be changed in there as well due to sodium concentration. So if you have increased interstitial fluid osmolarity, water is out of the cells and they shrink. So what happens is water is going to leave the cells to try and dilute the high concentration in the interstitial fluid. So with decreased interstitial fluid, water goes into the cell and the cell will swell. So the solute concentration is greater inside the cell, and water is going to go in to dilute it. So this just looks here at a flow of what happens when you increase the intake of sodium chloride or salt. You'll increase the concentrations in the plasma. You'll have increased osmosis of the water from the intracellular fluid to the plasma to try and increase the blood volume. So if you have increased stretching in the atria of the heart, you'll release the atrial natriuretic peptide. In the kidneys, you're going to have renin that will lead to the formation of angiotensin II and the release of aldosterone. All of this is going to be manifest itself as reduced reabsorption of sodium chloride by the kidneys, so you'll have more loss of water through the urine to decrease the blood volume. Water intoxication is also a dangerous scenario. We hear a lot about dehydration, but we rarely hear about water intoxication. But this happens when water is consumed faster than the kidneys can excrete it. Generally, this would occur after excessive blood loss, sweating, vomiting, diarrhea. So this is something that can happen at endurance events in hot water. Hot weather is a person would be thirsty and therefore consume a lot of water and instead of electrolytes. So they would be taking on too much water in here, and you would end up with hyponatremia, where you have a decrease in the sodium concentration of the interstitial fluid. So what will happen then is you'll have osmosis of the water from the interstitial fluid into the intracellular fluid, and water intoxication can occur when the cells begin to swell and can lead to convulsions, coma, and death. So this is just outlining those steps. So when we look at blood osmolality, if it's outside the normal range, you have an increase in there. It will be detected by receptors in the hypothalamus. You'll have ADH secretion. You'll increase thirst. You're going to take in more water, and a decrease in the blood osmolality to get back to homeostasis. So if the blood osmolality decreases, it's going to be detected by the hypothalamus. It will inhibit the ADH. It's going to decrease the permeability in the kidney, so more water is lost through the urine. It will increase the blood osmolality to get back to homeostasis. And this chart here just summarizes what happens with mechanisms to be able to regulate blood volume. So ADH is going to be an increase in the blood volume detected by the baroreceptors. So that's going to decrease ADH secretion and decrease the permeability so that you have less water returns to the blood and more water is lost in the urine. The atrial natriuretic peptide, when there's an increase in blood volume or blood pressure detected by the cardiac cells, you'll increase the atrial natriuretic peptide. Decreased aldosterone will decrease sodium reabsorption. Water is lost in the urine. Renin-angiotensin aldosterone system will increase things. Then you can inhibit the RAA system, and again, water is lost in the urine. So all of these things are going to be constantly going on to try and balance out the system. So if you find these tables helpful, they're a good way of studying and kind of walking through what the process is. So when we regulate the extracellular fluid, with low blood pressure, it stimulates the renin secretion from the kidneys. It's going to lead to angiotensin 1, then angiotensin 2, and aldosterone. It's going to increase sodium and water reabsorption, which raises the blood pressure. When the blood pressure is high in the right atrium of the heart, it can increase the secretion of atrial natriuretic peptide, increases the sodium secretion and water loss to lower the blood pressure. So the electrolytes in our body fluids are going to help to control the osmosis of water between the body components. They help maintain the acid-base balance. They can carry an electrical current, so it allows for the production of your action and graded potentials. It controls the secretion of some of the hormones and neurotransmitters. And then they can serve as cofactors for several enzymes. So now we're going to look at the specific electrolytes, and we're going to look at the ones in the extracellular fluid. So sodium is the major cation, so it's positive of the extracellular fluid. It's about 90% of it. It's involved with impulse transmission, muscle contraction, fluid and electrolyte balance. So if a person has hyponatremia, there's decreased sodium. This can correlate with diabetic acidosis, diarrhea, Addison's disease. Hypernatremia, increased sodium. This can correlate with Cushing's, dehydration, hyperaldosteronism. Edema occurs when you have excess sodium in the body. When you have that extra sodium, you're going to have that extra fluid in there, so the body will be puffier. Hypovolemia, this is when the sodium is low due to excessive water loss. So an abnormally low blood volume is generally going to be due to decreased aldosterone. So chloride is the major anion of the extracellular fluid. It helps to maintain hydration, osmotic pressure, and the normal anion-cation balance. So normally it's going to follow sodium. So if sodium is increased, chloride's going to be increased as well. Chloride's important for forming the hydrochloric acid in the gastrointestinal system. It's controlled indirectly by ADH. So where you have sodium reabsorption, this follows it. Hypochloremia is associated with diabetic acidosis, chronic pyelonephritis, prolonged vomiting because of the loss of stomach acid, and aldosterone deficiency. So that's going to be a decrease in chloride levels. Hyperchloremia is going to be an increase. This would be associated with prolonged diarrhea because of the loss of sodium bicarbonate, renal tubular acidosis, adrenocortical hyperfunction. So sweat chloride is increased in cystic fibrosis. So individuals with cystic fibrosis tend to have thicker mucus The chloride shift is the buffering system for the blood. This is where the bicarbonate is pulled out of the red blood cells and chloride moves into the red blood cell, and this is going to result in a decrease in the serum chloride. It's important to help maintain the correct balance of the anions in the extracellular and intracellular fluid. So bicarbonate is the second most prevalent extracellular anion. Here the concentration increases as blood flows through the capillaries due to the carbon dioxide. So concentration decreases when you exhale carbon dioxide. Kidneys are the main regulators of this. So that helps to tie the respiratory and urinary systems together. So the most abundant electrolytes in the intracellular fluid. So potassium is the major cation of intracellular fluid. It's 23 times higher in cells than it is in plasma. So this is important for resting membrane potentials, action potentials of nerves, and action potentials of muscles. It helps to maintain the intracellular volume and regulate the pH. It's controlled by aldosterone. Hypokalemia is when you have low potassium levels. It goes along with alkalosis, gastrointestinal losses, Cushing's disease, hyperaldosteronism, insulin injections, seen with muscle weakness, decreased smooth muscle tone, and bradycardia. Hyperkalemia with increased potassium. So this can go along with diabetic acidosis, burns, intravascular hemolysis, Addison's disease, renal failure, cramping, irritability, restlessness, and paralysis. Abnormal plasma potassium levels can adversely affect the cardiac and neuromuscular function, so they are important to stay in balance. So when we look at blood calcium levels, this looks at it. If blood calcium increases, it's going to act on the adrenal cortex to increase aldosterone secretion. It's going to increase the rate of secretion from the distal tubes in the collecting ducts of the kidneys and lower the blood potassium levels to get back to homeostasis. If the blood potassium levels decrease, it's going to act on the adrenal cortex to decrease the aldosterone secretion. That in turn is going to act on the kidneys, and the blood levels of potassium will increase to get back to homeostasis. So sodium-potassium pumps play a major role in keeping the potassium high inside the cells and the sodium outside the cells. We have some other important electrolytes. Calcium, it's the most abundant mineral in the body. It's in most body fluids, and it's a mostly extracellular cation. 3 hormones will control this. Parathyroid hormone is going to increase calcium reabsorption. You'll have osteoclast release of calcium from the bone. So the calcium reabsorption isn't necessarily going to come from an outside source here. Breaking down the bone may not be the best option to get it, but the body's going to take it where it can get it. Calcitonin will inhibit bone reabsorption, so that will decrease blood calcium. Vitamin D is important to increase absorption in the intestines. Vitamin D is important for blood clotting, neurotransmitter release, muscle tone, excitability of the nervous and muscle tissue. Hypercalcemia, when you have increased calcium levels, you can have muscle weakness, disorientation, hyperparathyroidism, bone cancer, multiple myeloma, and renal failure. Hypocalcemia is when it's low. You can have tetany, hypoparathyroidism, decreased albumin, and decreased vitamin D. So again, with these ions, it's not about having as much as possible. It's about having the proper balance of them. So this here, again, looks at how do we keep balance of this. So if the blood calcium levels increase, You're going to activate parathyroid hormone. That will trigger calcitonin. Increased calcitonin secretion is going to decrease the breakdown of bone matrix. Decreased PTH is going to decrease the breakdown of bone matrix. It's also going to decrease reabsorption in the kidneys and decrease the synthesis of vitamin D to lower the blood calcium levels to get back to homeostasis. If blood calcium is low, PTH is going to become activated, break down more bone. Calcitonin is going to get activated. It's going to break down more bone matrix. You're also going to have reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys and more vitamin D synthesis. So in cases of tetany, the first thing one should suspect is calcium. If calcium levels are okay, then look at magnesium or potassium. Phosphorus, this is a major phosphate in the body. It's got an inverse relationship with calcium, so if calcium is increased, phosphate is decreased. Increased phosphate is seen with hypoparathyroidism, chronic renal failure, excess vitamin D. Decreased phosphate with hyperparathyroidism, impaired renal reabsorption. 85% is present as calcium phosphate salts in the bone and the teeth, so that's where you're going to have most of it. 15% is ionized, is intracellular anions. It's an important buffer in the body fluids and urine, and calcitriol promotes the absorption of phosphates and calcium from the gastrointestinal tract. So again, another chart here looking at your blood phosphate as the ions increase. They can exceed the ability of the kidneys to reabsorb phosphate ions. More are going to remain in the filtrate and be eliminated in the urine to allow the blood phosphate levels to go down. If the blood phosphate ions are low, then the efficiency of phosphate ion reabsorption from the filtrate in the kidney will increase. You'll have less loss in the urine, more in the blood to get back to homeostasis. So magnesium is another important one. It's a calcium channel blocking agent that can affect the heart. It's increased in renal failure. It can be decreased in cardiac disorders, in diabetics, diuretic use, alcohol and drug use. In adults, 54% of the magnesium is part of the bone as magnesium salts. It's an important cofactor for certain enzymes in the sodium-potassium pump. It's essential to have normal neuromuscular activity and synaptic transmission. It's important for myocardial function, and then secretion of the parathyroid hormone is also going to depend on it. So again, we have this homeostatic mechanism here. If your blood magnesium levels increase, you can exceed the ability of the kidneys to reabsorb it, so more will be lost in the urine. If the levels decrease, you'll have more of it be reabsorbed in the kidneys, less lost in the urine, and more in the bloodstream to return back to homeostasis. So we will stop there and pick up acid-base balance in another video.